In moving this amendment, is the mic coming on?
We can hear you, I think.
In moving this amendment, I want to argue that this isn't just a technical bill that has an interim measure to allow cases involving land disputes to go to court or to the circuit court. At the moment, the law is that the rateable value of land determines which court it goes to. I don't accept it as a technical bill and has no implications for evictions down the road. Some people argue that this is the wrong place for the amendment that I'm putting today. Firstly, I want to argue that any bill that comes before this Dáil, it would be wrong of us if we don't try to use that legislation to deal with the most pressing issue that we as a country face. That's the housing crisis and the threat that lies over the heads of many of our citizens of a very uncertain future in terms of a basic human need, a basic human right, and that is the right to a home and to shelter. And secondly, it's entirely appropriate that any bill that deals with the mechanisms of court proceedings should address the tsunami of repossession orders and subsequent evictions that are presently and will in the short term be coming to the courts. The amendment I'm putting tonight, the two amendments that I'll be putting, seek, with no apology to legal niceties, to delay institutions from evicting families. Quite simple. They place a command on the courts to follow a procedure that would keep people in their homes until other measures can be taken to stop evictions and the threat of homelessness that hangs over them just before Christmas and beyond. They seek to stop vulture funds and those who have acquired bad debts from evicting tenants who may have never missed a rent payment in their lives but find themselves caught in the crossfire of big finance and corporate greed. So I'm speaking to both amendments now, but I can speak to the second one again. We have to do more and use every opportunity that we can to throw roadblocks and delays in the way of evictions. The response to this government of the unfolding crisis has been absolutely pathetic. The measures it brings are aimed only at incentivising developers and facilitating corporate landlords. And curiously, I note that while our amendments are attacked for being inappropriate to a bill that is just a technical bill to ensure efficiency in the court, the same bill contains an amendment to do with the Planning and the Development Act, an act that is subject of two or more bills to amend, mostly, I must say, with the purpose of boosting developers' profits and ensuring that landlords continue to reap the benefits of the rental crisis. So we find another small measure here to ease the burden of developers, ensure that changes to any SDZ planning is not hindered or delayed by subsequent alterations of that SDZ. It's telling that while nothing should get in the way of the feeding frenzy of developers, we're slow to place anything that might help those facing evictions or homelessness. And just let's look at the figures for a minute, because it's telling. Over 33,000 homes are in arrears on buy-to-let dwellings. Over 104,000 are in arrears on the principal private residency. Most evictions are taking place in the private rental sector. So over 30,000 people in mortgage arrears of more than 2 years could also be evicted. Of a total of 1,135 possession orders made by the Irish courts in the first 9 months of 2015, it shows a 70% increase over the 2014 levels, and that is a dramatic rise. So I want to argue that although this is being called a technical bill, a lot of it to do, or most of it to do, with land valuation, these amendments are using an opportunity to address the most serious issue the country faces. And I would argue that all deputies should avail of the opportunity to seek to put in amendments that will halt and slow down and stop evictions that are facing thousands of families in this country. And if you want to do anything for the citizens of this country coming up to Christmas, this is the very least you can do. And I want to reiterate that it's very curious that an amendment is put in to allow, a measure is put in the bill to allow for SDZs not to have to go through a planning process while it's being called a technical bill on land valuation. So I want to move this amendment and recommend to the House to accept that Amendment 6 is flawed in that it doesn't specifically state, as does Amendment 4, that this relates to the principal private residency rather than an office block or a hotel, and those few words are missing. But it is intended in the same context and in the same spirit as the previous amendment, and I think it curtails too with Deputy Healy's amendment. Look, I just want to point out that you're arguing here that this is not relevant to this bill, which is about land valuation, and we're looking at the bill here. All the amendments are about the valuation of land and changing the Valuation Acts, and I can understand the purpose of it, etc. But the argument you're making is that technically this is not relevant to the bill that you're putting forward. But you don't explain how Amendment 5 of Section 170A of the Planning and Development Act, to do with the SDZs that I referred to earlier on, which says that the Planning and Development Act should be amended to A in subsection 3A by the substitution of satisfies or fails to satisfy and deletion and may satisfy the criteria referred to in the paragraph, and it goes on. But basically this is dealing with the question of a measure which will allow developers to easily change an SDZ should there be an alteration or an amendment required to it. So why is there an amendment of the Planning and Development Act 2000 stuck into this, when there's two other, all week we're going to be discussing that, and that amendment could have been more appropriate there. So I would contend, and I would argue, and particularly given everything that's been said about the urgency of stopping evictions, about how families and the tens of thousands of them are facing the stress, the worry, the absolute emotional distraught and physical distraught consequences of the potential evictions that could take place, and those that have taken place and indeed are taking place. What is the problem with technically putting in an amendment that facilitates ordinary families to stay in their homes, as against an amendment which facilitates developers to bypass planning laws? And why is it appropriate for that amendment to be there, and one that deals with the current crisis for tens of thousands of families not to be there?